So the history of this talk started in a larger conference in Singapore, the Agile Singapore conference. And I did one of these typical introduction to LeSS talks where I explained the flow and the roles and all of these things. And I thought it was pretty good. In fact, you can see it online, they videotaped it. I thought it was a pretty good presentation, sorry. And then, this is getting annoying already now. Let me just try this one. There we go. So then a friend or a colleague of mine, he said, can you give a presentation in our conference in Shanghai? And the conference was called the AHA conference. And I said, sure. And he says, what are you going to talk about? I said, I'll talk about LeSS. And he says, well, what will you say? I said, well, I did this talk in Singapore, and I think it was great. And I thought I'll just do the same. It will be very easy. And he looked at me and he says, but that one was boring. And I was like, what do you mean? I think it was pretty good. And he said, no. But don't worry, it's not you. It's every talk about a framework must be boring. And I was like, wow, this is a challenge. So I was thinking, like, how can I make a talk about a framework that is not boring and that is interesting? And one of the things that I wanted to do is just tell a story, because stories tend to be interesting. And then the fireplace actually has some interesting history, because in our company, so I work for a small company called Audi, and one of the things we do is we get together every half a year, and one of the things we started doing was telling the creation stories of how the organization got created. But we have this session in usually a big room in Thailand, and we wanted to share the creation story of our own company, and we imagined that would be behind or be around a fireplace. But since we were in this big room, we decided to move away all the tables and chairs, and we went to YouTube to look for fireplace videos, and we put all our laptops playing fireplace videos in the center on the floor, and we set a circle around it telling the story of how the company got created. So I won't let you move the chairs and sit in a circle. The best alternative I have is to show this fireplace video. And did anyone, there's lots of fireplace videos in YouTube. Did anyone ever look for fireplace videos in YouTube? It's quite amazing, right? It's like they have this competition on who can make the longest fireplace video. There's one video, it's about 10 hours long, and if you read the comments, it says, thank you for the guy who kept the fire going for 10 hours. It's quite amazing. Anyway, so the story of LeSS. LeSS stands for Large Scale Scrum. It's a way of scaling Scrum to any size project. The largest project we use it for right now is about 2,500 persons on one project. And I actually don't know of a larger project than that one also. It started off about 10 years ago, when at that point I was working for a company called Nokia. I actually still work with a company called Nokia, but it was not the Nokia phone side, but the Nokia network side. Nokia phone side is now Microsoft. Nokia network side is now called Nokia. It didn't change. Or they actually did, but they're called Nokia again. And about 10 years ago, I was living in China. I'm originally from Holland. I moved to China, lived there for 5 years. And I was living in China. And in Nokia, they wanted to experiment with agile development. And they were looking in the organization for someone who had any experience in agile development. And it looked like I was the only one who had some agile development experience because of my background in the 90s working for startups in Holland. So they asked if I wanted to lead this agile change project. And I said yes, but then they said, then you need to move to Helsinki, Finland. I don't recommend living in Helsinki. Did anyone ever visit Helsinki? in the winter. Then you know why I live in Singapore.
I know where they like sausages as well.
So I moved from China to Helsinki. We started this large change project. In fact, it wasn't very large at all because it was just this experimental project to try out see if Agile development was something for building telecom equipment. And the first thing that we did was we started looking for somebody with a fairly broad Agile development knowledge because they had no idea what they were going to do yet. So we found a guy called Greg Larman who had just then written a book called Agile and Iterative Development, a Manager's Guide. Has anyone ever read that? Wow, that's a record amount in one group. Excellent. Did you like it? Informative. I guess that means no. Okay, so at that time it was a pretty good book. It was the only book that created kind of this overview of Agile development and covered like everything very shallowly. So we liked that and we asked him over whether he would like to work with us. And since then, for the last 10 years, I've been working together with him. And since we didn't know what we were going to do yet, one of the things that we started doing was having this huge 100, 200 person, one-day introduction to Agile sessions. And in that we would introduce iterative development, incremental development, and then Scrum, extreme programming, DSDM, things that are luckily dead now, like feature-driven development and other early Agile techniques. And we would just introduce everything just a little bit. And then we would go to product groups and we said, did that sound interesting to you? And what are you most interested in? And most of the product groups, they said, this sounds really interesting. And, this extreme programming thing that you've been talking about, that's a bit too extreme. But this Scrum thing that you mentioned, that sounds easy. So lots of products wanted to adopt Scrum. And not one, but Craig had been, if you wish, a little bit too successful. And he created lots of people wanting to try that out. So we had 10 or 20 product groups that wanted to start to apply Scrum. But then the key problem that we had is that within Nokia Networks at that time, still actually, there are no, so Scrum is described as a framework for one team, but within Nokia Networks, there are no products built with one team. The smallest product that we built had about 3 teams, and the largest products, they have no idea how many teams they have. It's a lot of them. So we had to figure out how to apply this Scrum thing to larger products, and we had no idea how to do that yet because nobody had done that so far. And not only that, because we had all these products, we had to kind of support 10, 20 different products with basically 2 people. And actually 1.5, because Craig at that time, he was traveling around the world, visiting company after company. He had no house. He just lived out of his suitcase and worked with clients supplying large-scale development, large-scale Agile development. So the only way we could survive was to go to products and we would have these conversations with them and we would propose them to do experiments. And sometimes we would help them with the experiments. And sometimes we would just come back a bit later and have a discussion on how the experiment went and figured out which experiments worked well and which didn't work well. A lot of what we now call LeSS is basically the way it is because of experiments that succeeded many times in large products. And some experiments were successful, and some experiments were, in retrospect, really just stupid, and it's obvious that they wouldn't work. Like one of the early experiments that we did was to have one product owner, one product backlog, which is still part of LeSS. For no matter how large the product, you always have only one product owner, not a product owner per team. We consider that a bad practice. You have one product backlog, and then you have multiple teams working out of this one product backlog. But then one experiment we did was to also share the sprint backlog between all of these teams. Don't do that. It doesn't work. It's a really bad idea. And in retrospect, it was pretty obvious that it was a bad idea. But at that point in time, we didn't really know. So we're just trying out all of these things to see what would work. And not only that, we would also try to get as much ideas as possible out of the industry. And one of the big influences to Agile development and to our experimenting had been Microsoft around the 90s. Because around the 90s, in the 90s, Microsoft actually knew how to build good software. That stopped after that. And there were two particular products that were really great because they came up with a lot of innovations. And these products were the Microsoft Excel product and the Microsoft Visual C++. And both of these products also in the marketplace were wildly successful. Microsoft Excel took over the spreadsheet market in about a year from, anyone old enough? I guess so. Lotus 1-2-3. And Visual C++, the compiler market from Borland. At that point in time, I was still a C++ developer, still actually. And Borland and C++ was basically equal to each other. And Microsoft just changed that in 1 year. And both of these projects, they had a book written by the development lead of these projects. For the Excel project, it was a book called Debugging the Development Process. Did anyone read that? Oh, that's too bad. And for Visual C++, it was a book called Dynamics of Software Development, written by a guy called Jim McCarthy, who's still quite active in the Agile community nowadays. And especially the dynamics of software development, they talked about two practices that were really, really important in the development of Visual C++. The first one was daily building, and as you might know, daily builds were taken from Microsoft, who applied that to all of their projects in the 90s, and it was taken from Microsoft by Kent Beck when he was creating extreme programming. And extreme programming is extreme programming because he took all the good practices and took them to the extreme. So daily builds became continuous integration. And the second practice was the practice of feature teams, in which you would create a team and then you would give them customer-centric features. And that was very important in Visual C++. And I'll go into a little bit of the details a bit later. But we read both of these practices, daily builds, we knew that it was important, and feature teams were a bit like, yeah, that sounds interesting, but it can't really work on large projects, etc. And ignoring the fact that Visual C++ was a pretty large project anyway. But we were different, just like all of you probably. And then a bit later, we read this obscure article called Large-Scale Extreme Programming or something like that. I forgot the exact title. And it was from two people from Ericsson base stations. And they built the AXE platform, which is the main base station platform. And they started adopting extreme programming practices to that. Now, that was very significant because Ericsson at that point was was the number one competitor of Nokia. So if your number one competitor starts applying extreme programming on their core product, that becomes very interesting for your company, for us at that point. And they described two practices that were particularly important, which were daily builds and feature teams. And the first time we read the article, we were like, yeah, not very interesting. And the second time we read it again and we're like, yeah, still not very interesting. And then we read it for the third time and we went like, wait a second, they're onto something really important, but they're not yet even realizing how important it is what they're describing and the changes that they've made. So the important change that they made is what we now call the difference between a component team setup and a feature team setup of your project. And I'd like to describe the kind of what the different setup is and the kind of problems they solve. So traditionally, most organizations or most projects are organized around component teams. Component teams means that the structure of your project is equal to your organization chart. So if you would take an architecture diagram and an organizational chart, then once they look similar, then that means you have a component team structure. So for example, to take the simplest scenario, you have a front-end team and a back-end team. Once you have a front-end team and a back-end team, you have a component team structure. Now, this works pretty well, except that one of the key problems with component team structures is that once you look at customer-centric features, a customer-centric feature doesn't fit to either a front-end or a back-end team. Because a customer doesn't really care about the front-end or the back-end. They want features, and features tend to cut across these two components. Now, that means that we have dependencies between the front-end and the back-end team in order to actually deliver customer-centric features. The dependencies between the two teams is not a real problem either yet. I for a long time actually thought that the dependencies between teams was a problem. It turns out that's not really a problem, but the big problem is that the dependencies are not balanced, right? Like if the customer would just only request features that have exactly the same amount as front-end as back-end work, then the teams can easily work together. But what happens is they request lots of features with lots of front-end work and little back-end work, and then later lots of features with lots of back-end work and little front-end work. And the effect of that imbalance is that the front-end team works on things that the back-end team won't work on yet, or the other way around. And therefore, they take a customer-centric feature, the front-end team works on it, they do their part, they integrate it, and then later the back-end team picks up the feature, they do their part, try to integrate it with the front-end team's work, but that actually never works. So then the back-end team starts interrupting the front-end team, and the front-end team will be annoyed because they are working on something else, and you get this conflict between the teams about dependencies that are happening asynchronous of each other. And it's this asynchronousness of dependencies that's actually the real problem. So feature teams means that we abandon organizing our organization around the architecture. And if we take the front-end and the back-end team, if we take that context, we basically take the two teams, we mix them and we split them again. And we create two teams named Team 1 and Team 2. And in Team 1 we have a bunch of front-end and back-end people, and Team 2 we have a bunch of front-end and back-end people. Then what we'll do is we'll take an end customer-centric feature and we just give it to Team 1, and then another feature and we give it to Team 2. And now there's no more dependencies. The teams can independently take an end-to-end feature and implemented in both the front end and the back end. So therefore all of the dependencies and the asynchronousness of the dependencies are solved. The only dependencies that we've left now is that both of the teams might need to make changes in exactly the same code at the same time. Now traditionally, having multiple teams work on the same components, it's a problem. But luckily, in Agile development, we have practices like daily builds and continuous integrations, which is exactly built for resolving that the problem of multiple people working within the same code. So that was why daily builds and feature teams in the history always were combined, and they always came hand in hand, because daily builds supported the idea of adopting feature teams. Now, we still have dependencies between the teams, but one of the interesting things that happens now is that imagine we have two teams and they both need to make changes in the backend at the same time. Then because now the dependency between the teams related to the code always happens at the same time. Therefore, the coordination between these teams becomes a lot easier. Right? When they need to change the backend at the same time, then they're both focused on that. So therefore, working together at that point in time is relatively easy. And when the dependencies don't happen at the same time, then there's no dependencies. Because then team A makes the change, and then later team B makes the change, or 1 and 2, and they're just independent of each other. So feature teams became the key structure that we were trying to, the key experiment that we tried out also in Nokia networks. And it worked wonderful, because almost all of the big planning, the dependency charts, all of that just fell away immediately. All of it was not necessary anymore because of the change in organizational structure. So now feature teams is one of the essential parts of LeSS. One of the rules in LeSS, and I'll get back to the LeSS rules in a moment. One of the rules in LeSS is that the majority of the teams when adopting LeSS must be feature teams. And usually this is the biggest change for organizations adopting LeSS, the change from a component team structure to a feature team structure, because it does tend to affect the whole organization. So, let's see how I'm doing. I'm still standing at least. I need a beer. And then I'll fall over. So for a couple of years, we were continuing our experiments in Nokia, and after I decided to leave Finland because it was too cold, and there's too few people there. And so I moved first back to China. I joined the large product that I worked with before, joined the management team of the product for a while, which was fascinating. Took this product of about 500 people to start adopting LeSS, and we started introducing the structures of what we now call LeSS Huge, which is the application of LeSS to more than 8 teams. And then after a while, Craig one day said, let's write some of the things down that we've done. Let's write a book. And I said, okay. I didn't write a book at that time yet, and I didn't know that it was not a good thing to do. It takes a lot of effort. So we actually ended up writing 2 books. The first one is called Scaling Lean and Agile Development. Did anyone ever read the first or the second book? Excellent. So they are literally catalogs of experiments. So all the experiments that we've done with Nokia and with all the other companies that Craig was traveling around we wrote down all of these experiments, and the whole book was sorted in 2 types of experiments. We called them the try and the avoid experiments. Sorry. The try experiments were like, we tried this out. It worked really well for us. There's no guarantee that it will work for you, but it worked really well for us. And then the avoid experiments were, we tried this out, it didn't work really well, these were the reasons why it didn't work, we recommend to avoid it, but maybe it will work for you, but it didn't work for us. Right? And then we wrote the second book, and in the second book we added the try-avoid experiments. And the try-avoid were like, we tried this out, and sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't work. These were the contexts in which it worked, and these were the contexts in which it didn't work. Try it out. And the whole goal of the book was to just give people, ideas to try out, because, we didn't want to prescribe how people should work. They should figure it out themselves based on their context. And so we released both of the books, and most of the people who read it, they kind of liked it. So most of the feedback was positive, and then some of the feedback was not incredibly positive. And of course, as young, arrogant authors, you ignore the not so positive feedback, and you say, stupid people, they didn't understood it. And then after a while, once you got over your ego, you try to understand a little bit more of the not so positive feedback. And the not so positive feedback, they were, in general, they were all the same, which were like, thanks, now we have 1,000 pages of experiments, but what do we do? Right? Like I now got 600 ideas, and not once did you say, you should do this. Right? So now I don't know where to start. And that was by intention. We didn't want to tell people what they should do or where to start. And instead, we just wanted to share our ideas. And eventually, one of the ways we started interpreting the feedback was via the Shu-Ha-Ri learning model. So the Shu-Ha-Ri is a learning model taken from Aikido. It was introduced by Alistair Coburn to Agile development very early on. Who's familiar with the Shu-Ha-Ri learning model? Excellent. So it basically says people learn in 3 different levels. The first level is Shu. Shu level is the beginner level. And when people are in Shu level, they need to be given rules. They need to be given prescriptions to follow. And then after a while, they move to Ha, and Ha is the beginning expert or the expert beginner. And they'll start learning when to break these rules. And then the Ri level is when you're an expert, and then you don't need rules anymore. You're the one basically creating the rules. And so when we reinterpreted our books in the Shu-Ha-Ri cycle, we realized that the problem was pretty obvious, which is we'd written the books for Ha and Ri. Right? We'd written the books for ourselves. We'd written the books that we would like to read at that point in time, but not for people that are starting an Agile adoption who needs prescription, because we don't want to give prescription. In fact, it's one of the essential parts also of LeSS, is that both Craig and me strongly believe that that the process, how people work, should be owned by the teams itself. And therefore, we don't want to give prescription, because the more processes you give, the more people will follow it. And the more people will follow it, the less they will think. And the less they will think, the less they will experiment and try out new things within their context. So therefore, we don't want to give any prescription. right? So now we're having this conflict, which is we don't want to give any prescription because we believe in, Scrum is the same, the empirical process control where the team is constantly inspecting and adapting their process. But we need to give prescription because otherwise people are lost. They don't know where to start. But we don't want to give prescription because we don't want the process to own the process. We want the people to own the process, right? But we must give prescription because otherwise people won't even start. So we're in this conflict of, should you prescribe or should you not prescribe? And we're stuck in that until suddenly we realized this conflict has been solved already. Because Scrum had exactly the same conflict. It's trying to give as much of the ownership of how people work to the teams themselves. Yet, Scrum is extremely prescriptive, right? It's so prescriptive, it tells you that you must have a 15-minute meeting, you must stand up, and you must answer 3 questions. It can't get much more prescriptive than that. Right? So, if you think about Scrum, it adds the prescription at the places where the prescription adds transparency, adds feedback, so that the team can take more ownership of their own development. And we suddenly realized that what we ought to be doing is we have to add that prescription. But we want to add the prescription at the same places as Scrum does that. We want to add prescription that increases the ownership of the people to their process. We want to add prescription for transparency and feedback. Unless we went a little bit further than that, because one of the things that Scrum does is it talks as if there's no context, right? If you get introduced to Scrum, it will say, Scrum works this and this way, and then you go like, yeah, but my organization doesn't work that way. And then Scrum is kind of neutral, it just says, yeah, figure it out. And LeSS is a bit more prescriptive there in the sense that it also takes some prescription on the structure of your organization, such as the majority of the teams must be feature teams. So we started asking the question, what is the minimum, the absolute minimum prescriptive set of rules that we would expect people need to do when they scale up Agile development and Scrum? And we ended up with 3 pages of LeSS rules. And of these 3 pages, we actually divided that in 2, which is the basic LeSS rules and the less huge rules. Because we decided to divide the framework into 2, the basic LeSS, which is from 2 to 8 teams, and then the less huge, which is if you have more than 8 teams on your product, then you need to introduce a couple of additional scaling techniques. But one of the things that went wrong early on in our earlier work is that people started applying this scaling techniques for projects with hundreds of people to projects with only 2 or 3 teams. So by dividing the rules into less and less huge, we could also make it clear that people should not apply the really large project rules into the not so large projects, because you add too much unnecessary processes and complexity to your project. So we ended up with 3 pages of rules. As I mentioned already, there are 3 types of rules. The Scrum-based rules, which is how do you do sprint planning? So sprint planning 1 in LeSS is a shared meeting across all teams. Sprint planning 2 is independently between the teams. All the teams work in one sprint, so they don't have their individual sprint. At the end of the sprint, there must be one integrated product, and the teams are responsible for the coordination and integration during the sprint. there's one sprint review at the end of the sprint where we look at the whole integrated product. There's separate sprint retrospectives for each team, and then LeSS adds actually one meeting, which is the overall retrospective, which happens after the individual retrospective, where product owners, Scrum Masters, representative of the teams and management get together and they talk about systemic and organizational problems and try to also tackle those. There must be one product owner, one product backlog, multiple teams working off that one product backlog. I already mentioned that. So those are the rules related to how to interpret Scrum for multiple teams. And then last type of rules that we added is rules for adoption. So LeSS actually gives, on rule level already, advice on how you should change to adopt LeSS. If you have only a couple of teams, you ought to make the change from component teams to feature teams all at once. Try to avoid gradual change. Because if you do these changes gradually, the pain will be more than if you just do it all at once. But if you have more than 8 teams, please do not make an all-at-once transition because it will be just messy and painful because there's too much people involved. So we now defined the LeSS framework rules, and we have the 600 plus experiments. That's still a part of LeSS, but they're just ideas that you should try out. And the gap between 3 pages of rules and 1,000 pages of experiments was a little bit too big, and we decided there needs to be something in between. There needs to be what we now call guides. And guides help people interpret the rules within context. So they help people to figure out what the rules actually mean when you apply them to organizations. So we started writing about 50 or so guides. And we started writing a new book that should be out, it should be out last year. Craig tricked me in it. No, seriously, he said, "Bas, shall we write a new book?" I said, "No." I says, "But this one is easy." I said, "No." He says, "But this one will be, we just take all our earlier work and we copy paste it together in a shorter version. Just 1 month," he said. So I said, "Okay, I'll do that." And that's now 2.5 years ago. I should know that it's 2 perfectionists working together, and copy-pasting things is never going to be acceptable to us. So it turned out to be a much larger project again than I expected, but hopefully it will really be finished next year. So that contains guides. So now we got this model of LeSS where we got the large set of experiments which are not prescriptive at all. Then we got the 50 guides which are clarifying and somewhat prescriptive. Then we got the 3 pages of rules, which is the absolute minimum thing that you need to do. And we felt something is missing still. So we added to the center of LeSS what we now call the 10 LeSS principles. So we added 10 principles, and these 10 principles are kind of also dividable in 3 categories. They're the Scrum principles, such as transparency and empirical process control. And then there's principles that are not principles, such as lean thinking and systems thinking. It's quite funny to make lean thinking a principle in LeSS. It's quite absurd because lean thinking by itself is such a huge subject, larger than LeSS. To make it a principle in LeSS doesn't make any sense, and we like doing that anyway. And then there's a couple of less specific principles, and I'd like to share two of them with you. And they really, I think, the more and more I think about it, these two principles define what LeSS is about and why it's so different than other scaling frameworks also out there. And the first one is a principle which we call large-scale Scrum is Scrum. So LeSS is Scrum. And this principle is interesting because if you think about scaling Agile development or Scrum, you can think about it from two different perspectives. And you can basically divide all scaling framework out there into these two categories. And the first one is we can look at Scrum or any Agile method as this team-based process. So therefore, the key scaling problem is that we have 10 teams doing Scrum, and we need to figure out how to get 10 Scrum teams to actually work together to build a product. Right? That's not the way LeSS looks at scaling at all, but things like things that are not a very good idea, such as SAFe, they actually look at it from that perspective. How can we get multiple of these Scrum teams to actually work together? Now, the way LeSS looks at scaling is very different. It looks at Scrum as a one-team framework, and then it asks the question, how can we apply Scrum not to one team, but to multiple teams? So how can we apply the same concepts to a context where we just not have one team? Right? Nowadays, we sometimes describe this as the difference between multiple Scrum teams versus multiple team Scrum. Right? And LeSS is not multiple Scrum teams, but it's multiple team Scrum. It's a very different way of thinking about scaling than most other techniques. And if you think about LeSS as multiple team Scrum, then almost all of the LeSS rules will be an automatic conclusion from that principle. Right? Of course we have one product owner. We have one product. We have one Scrum, so we have one product owner. Of course we have one product backlog. Of course we have one sprint. Of course we have one product coming out of that one sprint. All of those are just a logical conclusion from the principle large-scale Scrum is Scrum. Now the second principle that really defines how LeSS is completely different than most other frameworks and other adoptions is the principle which we call more with less. And I actually, let's see how my fireplace is doing. That's pretty good. I actually wanted to show another video, and I'm not showing this video purely for the wonderful French accent of this person, but mostly for the context. And I hope that the sound will work, but we'll see. Otherwise, it's too bad. So I like this. This is a small scene from a TED talk from a French guy called Yves Morieux. And I like to share this video because it's one of the best ways in which I've seen somebody explain the more with less principle. Better than I could probably do it myself. Let me see if this is going to work. There we go. Oh, there.
Attract and retain customers. That it is much.
At least it has subtitles, so that will work. Ignore that, please.
Much more demanding today to attract and retain customers, to build advantage on a global scale, to create value. And the more the business gets complex, interfaces, middle offices, coordinators that do not only mobilize people and resources, but that also add obstacles. And the more complicated the organization, the more difficult it is to understand what is really happening. So we need summaries, proxies, reports, key performance indicators, metrics, so people put their energy in what can get measured at the expense of cooperation. And as performance deteriorates, we add even more structure, process, systems. People spend their time in meetings, writing reports. They have to do, undo, and redo. Based on our analysis, teams in these organizations spend between 40 and 80% of their time wasting their time. But working harder and harder, longer and longer, on less and less value-adding activities. This is what is killing productivity, what makes people suffer at work. Our organizations are wasting human intelligence. They have turned against human efforts. When people don't cooperate, don't bring their mindsets, their mentalities, their personality. Look at the work situations. Is it really in their personal interest to cooperate or not? If when they cooperate, they are individually worse off, why would they cooperate? When we blame personalities instead of the clarity, the accountability, the measurement, we add injustice to effectiveness. We need to create organizations in which it becomes individually useful for people to cooperate. Remove the interfaces, the middle offices, all these complicated coordination structures. Don't look for clarity, go for fuzziness. Fuzziness overlaps. Remove most of the quantitative metrics to assess performance. Speed, the what. Look at cooperation, the how.
Let me put the fire back. Otherwise, whoops. So one of the, another way, I love the way Yves is able to explain how you want to create simplicity in your organization, because this simplicity in your organization enables your coordination. If you add more and more complicated structures, it doesn't actually enable more cooperation in your organizations. So another way of looking at this is a way that was described in an old book written by a guy called Barry Beam. It was called Balancing Agility and Discipline. It was published, I think, in 2004 or 2005. Did anyone read that? Did you like it?
In parts, yes.
That's actually a very good answer. So it wasn't a very good book. For all the other people, don't read it. Don't bother. But it's a very interesting book because of the author. Because Barry Beam is a person who's been around in our industry for forever. And if you trace back the history of waterfall development, you will always end up with him. So he's kind of like the inventor of waterfall development, writing a book about agile development. So that makes the book very interesting. But once you read it, you'll notice that he doesn't understand agile development very well. It's full with misconceptions about agile development. But it contains a couple of things that are particularly insightful because of the perspective that he brings, the traditional perspective, if you wish. And one of them was where he said, the one thing that we agile people need to learn, that we traditional people need to learn from agile development is that the whole idea of tailoring down a method is wrong. We should not tailor down, but we should scale up. Now let me explain that a bit. So tailor down is what basically all the traditional processes do, which is we create a process for too much. For every situation, we'll create a process. But then we go to organizations and we say, don't worry, you don't need all of that. Right? You just need to remove the things that you don't need and keep only the things that you really need. Right? So that's tailoring down. And he says that's a bad idea, that doesn't work, that's where we've gone wrong in our industry. And why? Well, if you think about it, it's pretty obvious. Because if you start a new product, and often you start a new process, when you start a new product, and at that point you have the least amount of knowledge about your users, the least amount of knowledge about your technology, the least amount of knowledge about your size, and often the least amount of knowledge about your processes. So with what information are you going to tailor it down? Right? You have the least amount of knowledge of all of these. So therefore, what happens is that people take this large process and they ask the question, gosh, I wonder if in our product we need to have a release train conductor. Well, we're not really sure yet. Right? So we'd better keep it just to play safe. Right? We'd better keep it. So what happens is that projects, they tend to have too much of the of processes and too much artifacts and too much roles, and people start. The process starts owning the process, and people just start following it, and they don't take any ownership of their process. They don't collaborate. They don't work together anymore because they can only work together via the specific coordination event or the specific coordination meeting. And so Barry Boehm said 10 years ago, that's the mistake. Instead of that, we need to look for the absolute minimum. And we need to tell people, this is the minimum thing that you need to do. And only if you need more, only if it really hurts, then you add to that. Because then, when you create this absolute minimum core, you create this simplicity in organizations on how to work with your development. And then people will need to take ownership because there is no process that they can look for and say, oh, we need to do it this way. But they will need to experiment and they will need to coordinate. And this is what the more with less principle is about. We want to create more ownership and more output with less rules, artifacts, roles, and structure. So we want to create more with less. And with that, I'm going to end this talk. Thank you very much. I'm still standing.